Masechet Ketubot, Daf Sadi Vav. We begin the 11th perek. Almana nizonet minichsei yetomim, maaseh yadeha shelahen, ve'en hayavin bikvurata. We're talking about the relationship between a widow and the inheritors, will be the sons of her husband, which are not necessarily her children. They could be his children from another marriage. And we learned that a widow, although she can get a one-time payout of her ketubah, she may prefer to be fed and keep the ketubah in the inheritance, in the property of the orphans, and the orphans instead will pay her sustenance, just like the husband has to pay sustenance when he's alive. So the estate will pay her sustenance after the husband has died. So that's what happens. And in return, her wages, the work that she does, will go to the orphans. Just like when they were married, he paid for her food and sustenance, and she did work and chores and produced dough and spins wool, and the wages for whatever she works goes to the husband. So that's a fair exchange. However, the orphans do not have to pay for the burial of the widow. That's because when the husband is alive, the husband does have to pay for his wife's burial, and that's in exchange for his right to inherit his wife's property. So he gets the inheritance and he pays for her burial. However, her inheritance is not going to be her money is not going to be inherited by the orphans, and so they don't have to pay for her burial. Instead, if she has children from another marriage or her closest family, they'll be the ones that will inherit her or her ketuvah payment. And so since they inherit, whoever inherits the person is the one that has to pay for the burial. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Ibayalehu question. Nizonet tenan or hanizonet tenan? In this Mishnah, we read it almana nizonet, but maybe there's supposed to be a he over here. This difference of one letter makes a big impact. Nizonet tenan uchshanse anshe galil velasagi de la yahavila. Do we say nizonet? And reading it that way, it's prescriptive. A widow must be sustained from the property of the orphans. That is, until she says, I'd rather a payout. That's her prerogative. Or until she's married. When she gets married, then her new husband takes care of her. But as long as she's single and she wants to continue getting sustained, rather than her one lump sum payment, the orphans have to give it to her. And that's what they do in Galil, where they write a clause in the marriage contract says that it's her right to remain in the husband's house. She can remain living there, and that the orphans have to support her. And it's not within the rights of the orphans to say, here's your ketubah, get out of the house, we're not sustaining you. So that would be without a he, means it's prescriptive. The orphans must sustain her as long as she wants. Or dilma hanizonet natenan ushense Yehudavi ba'u la yahavila. Or if we add a he, then we read it as a condition. A widow who is sustained from the property of the orphans, meaning if they want to sustain her, because they don't want to pay the one-time payment, because for example, that would mean that they have to sell land in order to give this big payout. So they'd rather keep the land and then pay her over, just keep her sustained over time. And so if they want to, they can do that, or so if they want to, they can give her one-time payment, or if they decide they want to sustain her, they can, and then in return they get the wages. So is this a prescriptive that they have to, or a condition that if they sustain her, then they get the wages? So we don't know if it has a he or not. Okay, as a tangent, this question of whether this Mishnah is read with a he or not was a question that was asked to Harambam in his Teshuvot. He records the following: Teshuvah she'ela linan almanah nizonet tenan or nizonet tenan. Someone asked a question to Rambam about this and the fact that we're not sure if it says hanizonet or nizonet. Wait a second, why is the Gemara asking if it has a hair or not? The Mishnah is in front of us. Go check your Mishnah, right? Why are we asking about it? The Rambam's answer is Deuki al nusach Mishnah echi en lishael. He says regarding the text of the Mishnah, what exactly it is, you cannot ask for a definitive answer because V'chi Mishnah sefer azarahi she'en ba ot chasera or ot yetera is the text of the Mishnah like the text of the Tanakh, that especially the Torah text that was kept in the Bet HaMikdash, the best version that was the model for all others. There in the Torah, we're careful regarding any extra letter or missing letter. It has to be perfect. But the Mishnah is not transmitted letter for letter perfectly. ומניין אנו יודעים איך כתב רבנו הקדוש במשנה ניזונת או הניזונת, אלא מזקנים ולא מן הספרים. How would we know how Rabbeinu Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote the Mishnah? We only know it from the elders and not from books, which means Rambam is suggesting that the main way Mishnah was transmitted was not from written text, but rather orally from the elders who would teach it and recite it. And so sometimes you can remember, some remembered Nizonet, some remembered Ha-Nizonet, and even if there were books, they weren't as reliable as a Sefer Torah that was kept with a hair or without a hair. So it's fascinating because it reveals Rambam's opinion that the Mishnah was transmitted primarily orally, even though he wrote Katav Rabbeinu, which would suggest that Rabbeinu Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did write it, but even if he wrote it, it was transmitted orally. Okay, this is important because it clarifies what people often think, that Rambam, because in the Hakdama, the introduction to Mishnah Torah, he wrote that Shinu Lachamim Barabim Rabbi Yehuda Nasi taught it, which is orally, Mishnah to the public, v'chatvuhu kulam, and everybody wrote it. So people assume that according to Rambam, the Mishnah was written, but here you see that maybe it was written, but primarily the transmission was oral, and that's what allowed for these types of variants that even the Gemara itself is not sure if it's nizonet or hanizonet. All right, well, with that question, let's see if we can have an answer. Tashem Amar Rabbi Zera Amar Shemuel Mesiat Almana Le'atzma. Now, Shemuel said that a found item that a widow finds, she can keep. She sees a watch in the street, she can keep it. If we say that it's a condition and the orphans can decide if they want to sustain her, then fine, otherwise not. Then the statement of Shemuel would make sense. This would be in a case where the orphans decided, we're not going to sustain you, right? You keep your wages, you keep whatever you find, and that's why when this found object, she keeps. So Shemuel's law, it makes sense. But if we say without a head, nizonet, and it's a prescription, the orphans have to sustain her, whether they want to or not, well then they are in the same position as the husband, just like when she's married, whatever she finds goes to the husband, so also whatever she finds will go to the orphans because they have to and they are sustaining her. So then what would Shemuel be talking about? So that would prove that hanizonet is a condition. But we say not necessarily. It could be in fact nizonet, that there's an obligation. And even if they are sustaining her, nevertheless she can keep the item that she finds. Why? Because the only reason that the item that she finds goes to the husband, why did the rabbis institute that? That's only so that there shouldn't be ill will between the wife and husband. If she finds some item worth $1 million, and now the husband is going and he's working hard and feeding her, and meanwhile she has $1 million, so he's going to feel ill will that she is rich and he still has to provide for her. And so therefore we say, listen, as long as he's providing the food and house and everything, so anything she finds, like anything she makes wages, goes to him, that will provide for shalom bayit. But the orphans, so let them have ill will towards her. Who cares? They're not married to each other. They have a monetary obligation. If someone owes me rent, and then I win the lottery, so they still owe me rent. So then they begrudge that they have to pay rent to someone who won the lottery. Doesn't matter. They still have to pay. So let them begrudge it. So we don't care about shalom bayit between the orphans and their stepmother. So therefore, she keeps whatever she finds, even if they are sustaining her. Amar Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina, Kol melachot שהאישה עושה לבעלה, האלמנה עושה ליורשים, חוץ ממזיגת הכוס והצעת המיטה והרחצת פניו, ידיו ורגליו. So now that we're on the topic of the widow and the orphans, we continue, and the other obligations also apply. Any chores that a wife needs to do for her husband, right? We listed back then 7 different chores. A widow also has to do when she is living in the house and being sustained by the orphans, right? She would actually, in the Galil, she would remain living in the house of her deceased husband. So she has to do all those. That would include laundry and making the dough, except that she does not have to mix the wine and fill it. That she does for her husband as an act of endearment. Here I'm serving you wine. She doesn't have to serve the orphans. Making the bed is also an act of endearment and intimacy. She makes their bed that they sleep in together. She does not need to do that for the orphans. And washing her husband's face and hands and legs, that also shows her special affection to her husband and is not a fundamental requirement, and she would not do that for the orphans. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Kol melachot שהעבד עושה לרבו, תמיד עושה לרבו חוץ מהתרת מנעל. And now they're on the subject of doing work for others. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says an important principle. Anything that a slave would do for his master, right? A slave is following his master and doing even menial work and helping the master out. So a student also does for his teacher. So you see, in those days, students would just come to class and pay attention and do their homework and then go home. They would actually serve the master physically, attending to the master's needs, getting them food, taking care of their laundry. Anything that the master wanted was part of the relationship, and increased reverence between the student and teacher, except for removing his shoes. A slave, one of his jobs was to untie the master's shoes. Remember, they're walking in streets that are full of all kinds of animal waste and things. So this was a very menial job that a slave would do. And if people saw that the student was doing it and not knowing better, they'd say, "Oh, that must be his slave." And that would not be appropriate for a student. But Rava says this is only true that the student doesn't take off his teacher's shoes when people don't know him, and they'll say, "Oh, I guess that's a slave," and think he's Eved Kanani, he's not Jewish. But if people know him, also that's a student, then the student should take off his master's shoes. In other words, it is appropriate for a student to be that subservient to the teacher, even take off his shoes. We just don't want him to be mistaken for being a slave. Might be hard for him to get married then. Amar Rav Asher, במקום שאין מכירין אותו, נמי לא מרן אלא דלמנח תפילין, אבל מנח תפילין נתן בה. This is even in a place where people don't know him. If the student is wearing tefillin, then that will show that he is fully Jewish and not an Eved Kanaani. But if he's not wearing tefillin, but usually they would wear tefillin most of the day, but if it happens to be that he's not wearing tefillin, like if it's at night, and then people seeing will think it's an Eved Kanaani. Technically, an Eved Kanaani is chayab b'mitzvot like a woman is, and so therefore they could voluntarily wear tefillin, but generally they did not. And therefore, if they're not wearing tefillin, that would indicate that it was an eved. So, but if he's wearing tefillin, then people looking would say, "Oh, that's a student." So it's fine. It's fine for the student to do this subservient labor for his teacher. but he should not have to be mistaken as a slave. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan kol monea talmido mileshamesho kilu monea mimenu hayased. Further on this theme, Rabbi Yochanan says that if a teacher stops a student from serving him, then he is removing a kindness from the student. It's actually good for the student to serve the master. In other words, teachers shouldn't be all humble and say, no, I don't want you to serve me. It's actually good part of the education of the student that they should serve the master, so the teacher should allow it. Shene'emar lamas mere'ahu hased, as the pasuk says. This is a difficult pasuk to translate. Here JPS translates, a friend owes loyalty to one who fails, though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty, which would make sense in the context here of Iyov saying, even if I did fail, I deserve to have good friends, unlike you guys, right, who accuse me of all kinds of terrible things. Okay, but the translation admits that the Hebrew is uncertain, so it's difficult to translate. Here they translate, to him who is ready to faint from his friend, kindness is due. Okay, but anyway, Rabbi Yochanan is reading it as meaning to remove, as in the pasuk, Achenu hemasu et lababenu, our brethren melted our hearts, meaning they removed our courage. So if a teacher removes himself and does not give the opportunity to the student to serve him, then Mereu Chased, he is preventing kindness to him. So as a teacher wants to be kind, he should allow himself to be served by the student. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Omer, Af porek mimenu yirat shamayim shemar v'yirat shaddai ya'azov. The continuation of that pasuk is, he forsakes the fear of heaven, meaning the teacher is also removing the fear of heaven from the student, because a student can learn fear of heaven through the teacher, by serving the teacher, being subservient, lowering his ego, and honoring the Torah that his teacher represents. That will be a pathway to which he can learn also to have Yirat Shamayim. Just like in the Ten Commandments, Kibud Av V'Em is on the last of the first 5, on the Ben Adam Lamakom, because it's a kind of transition, even though they are people, and so your Ben Adam Lachavero, nevertheless it's a transition, because through honoring parents, one can understand honoring one's own creator. So too, this is actually good training in Yirat Shamayim to have Yir'ah from one's master. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Almana shetafsa metaltilin bimzonoteha, ma shetafsa tafsa. Okay, back to our regular subject. If a widow goes and seizes movable items for her sustenance, I guess the orphans are not providing the money or food on time, she goes and seizes movable objects. That is valid, right? Whatever b'di avad, what she takes, she can keep. Tanyana mehachi, almana shetafsa metaltin b'zonoteha ma shetafsa. This is also a baraita that confirms the same law. Vechen. כי אתה רב דימי אמר, מעשה בחלתו של רבי שבתאי, שתפסה דיסקיה מלאה מעות, ולא היה כוח ביד חכמים להוציא מידה. And there was an actual case. When Rav Dimi came from Israel, he reported that Rav Shabtai's daughter-in-law came, and she was a widow, and she wanted money. She came and seized a saddlebag. This is a diskayam that may come from Greek, meaning double, di sack, a double sack that would go on each side of a donkey. So she grabbed this sack that was full of money, and for her sustenance, and the rabbis got together and they said, yep, she can keep it. They didn't find any legal way to take it away from her, so that is valid. Ravina said she can seize movable objects only for her sustenance, but if she's owed a marriage contract, and she seizes movable objects, then we take it back from her, because a marriage contract, she has a lien on property. Even if it's sold, she should go and get the property that's liened, and she cannot just go and take movable objects. Matkifla Mor bar Rav Asher. However, Mor bar Asher rejects what Ravina said. So why would you say that in the Ketubot, if she comes and grabs stuff, she has to give it back? Because the Ketubah is paid by land and not by movable objects, that's the same is true also for sustenance, that is paid. She has a lien on land and not on movable objects. And so it should be the same thing. If she grabs movable objects, then she should have to pay it back. Go and grab land that the orphans have in their possession, if you want. Rather, it's the same law for both of them. There is no difference. And just like for sustenance, although she has a right to be paid from land, but if she does go and seizes movable assets, she keeps them. Also for ketubah, she also gets to keep them, even though it's her lien is only on land. Amar le Rav Yitzchak bar Naftali Ravina, hachi amrinan mishemed Rabba kevatich. Rav Yitzchak bar Naftali supports Ravina by saying that we also heard that Rava teaches the same way that you do, that if she removes objects for sustenance, she can keep them, but not for a ketubah. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishmed Rabbi Yosef ben Zimra. אלמנה ששהתה 2 שנים ולא טבעה מזונות, איבדה מזונות. So he says that if a widow waits 2 or 3 years without demanding sustenance, she just doesn't come to the orphans to ask them for money, she loses her right to that sustenance. She cannot go back and collect it, right? What are you doing waiting so long? It means that you didn't care about it, so you must have forgiven your right. Hashta shtaim ibeda. We asked a question on Rabbi Yochanan's statement. If you told me Hashta shtaim ibeda shalosh mibaya, if after 2 years she loses the right, why do you have to tell me 3 years? What do you mean 2 or 3? La kashya kan ba'aniya kan ba'ashira. Rather, it says 2 or 3 for different cases. If she's poor, then 2 years shows that she forgoes her right to sustenance, because a poor person needs the money, and so she gets a shorter runway. If after 2 years she doesn't come when she's poor, that means she doesn't want to take it. Whereas if she's rich, so she has other funds, she's sustaining herself, so she just never got around to collecting it. So for that, really only after 3 years, that shows that she doesn't care and forgives that money. Iname kan bepirusa, kan besunua, or another way to answer it is, if she's a woman who's not shy and she'll come and bang on the door and say, give me my money, then we give her 2 years, because after 2 years, this not shy person didn't ask for it, so it means she forgot about it and forgave it. Whereas if she's shy, a modest woman, she's shy, she doesn't want to come, so then it's understandable that even 2.5 years, maybe she's too shy to come and ask for it, but after 3 years, then we say that she forgave it. Says Rava says this is only about what she was owed in the past, that after 2 years or 3 years, she can't go back and collect what was owed her in the past. But if she says, starting from now on, I want to be sustained, she has every right to do that, because she doesn't lose her right for sustenance altogether. This is just getting back pay. Ba'ed Rabbi Yochanan, Yetomim omerim natanu, v'omeret lo natalti, ami lehavi ra'aya. If there's a fight between the orphans and the widow, the orphans say, we gave you sustenance, right? We gave you, in the beginning of the year, a check to last you the whole year, and she says, no, I never got anything. Who has to bring the proof? We always have a principle, whoever is trying to extract money. But the question is, who is in possession of the property and who's extracting money? This would seem to be the obvious choice, that the orphans are the one that are actually holding in charge of the property, right? They're controlling the land, and therefore the widow would have to bring a proof that she was never paid, right? Here, look, right? Here's all my checked, deposited checks, and you never paid me. Or do we say that the inheritance is actually, the land is actually under the possession of the widow? Why so? Because she has a lien on the land to pay her sustenance. And therefore, as long as she has a lien, she actually owns the land, even though the orphans are the ones that are farming it. Nevertheless, she owns it, and therefore she has the chazakah, and it's the orphans, they have to bring a proof that they paid. So let's try to find an answer. Tashema detani Levi almana kol zman shelo niset al yatomim levi re'aya niset aleh levi re'aya. Levi has a good answer that splits the difference. He says that if she is a widow and she's not yet married, she's still single, then the orphans have to bring a proof because she, as a single person, has a right to lien on the property she can collect. Niset, once she gets remarried, however, then she's under her husband's authority. He's taking care of her sustenance, and so now the orphans have no obligation to give her sustenance anymore, so she loses the lien on the property. Once she loses the lien, if she wants to go back and collect, now she has to bring the proof because the land is under the orphan's domain. All right, that's Levi's opinion. Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashe ketanae mocheret vekotebet elu limzonot macharti ve'elu lichtuba macharti divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Shimi bar Ashe says actually the answer to the question is this is all Rabbi Yochanan's question, is that it's a machloket between two Tanaim that are recorded in the following Baraita. If a woman, she's a widow, and she goes and takes some of the property that was in her husband's estate, and she has a right to it, and she sells it, and she should write down when she sells it that I'm selling this piece of land for my sustenance, and this other piece of land I'm paying towards my ketuvah. Maybe not in full, but right, it'll be towards that much. She should document exactly what she's getting for each part. The reason for that would be if she doesn't write it, then the orphans will be able to come and tell her, oh, you sold this amount, this land, that was all for your ketubah, and the mizonot, oh, we paid you separately for that. No, so you see that she has to bring a proof for what she's using it for, so it's the burden of proof is on her. Rabbi Yosef omer mocher v'kotevet satam v'ken kolcha yafeh. Whereas Rabbi Yosef said she can just sell it and just write, I'm selling it for, she doesn't have to write the reason, and in that way, her options and her power will be enhanced, because that way she can come later and say, oh, that land that I sold, that was for my sustenance, but you never paid me the ketuvah, and now you also pay the ketuvah. So that way she can decide later what she wants to apply that to, and that way that keeps her options for collection open. Ma'idla behakami palged Rabbi Yehuda damar ba'elef arushe sabar nichse bechizkat yatme kaime v'ala halmana lehavi re'aya. So aren't they disagreeing regarding Rabbi Yochanan's very question? According to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that she should write explicitly what I'm selling this land for sustenance or for the ketubah, it's because he thinks that the orphans are the ones that have the chazakah on the land, and she's going to have to bring a proof to show, hey, I got paid for this, but I didn't get paid for that. So she has to keep all her receipts. Whereas Rabbi Yosef says she doesn't have to write anything because she is in the possession of the land, and it would be the orphan's obligation to prove that, oh no, use that money for sustenance, so we don't have to pay you sustenance again. So therefore, she does not have to keep the receipts and tally of what she used it for, since it's not, the burden of proof is on the orphans. So therefore, it's a machloket tanaim. Now we reject this. Mimai dilma dekola alma nichse becheskat almana kaimeh v'ala yetumim laviraya. Maybe in fact both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosef here would agree that the money is in the hands of the land is in the hands of the widow, and therefore the orphans have the burden of proof. But Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda says, really, according to Rabbi Yehuda, from the letter of the law, she doesn't have to write anything, and they would have to bring a proof that she didn't use the money for whatever she says she uses it for. But Rabbi Yehuda nevertheless said she should write, I'm selling this part of the land for sustenance and that part of the land for ketubah, because just better for the aesthetics. We don't want people to look at her as a glutton. Look how much she's taking. You ever see someone at a wedding? They're holding 2 giant plates, right? It says, okay, that's a lot for one person to eat. They say, no, I made one plate for my wife, one for me. He says, yeah, that's what they all say, right? So if she's selling so much and everyone's looking, it's like, wow, you eat that much. Look how much your land you're selling. So she should make it clear so that she doesn't get a bad reputation that she must be spending too much on food. That part of it is for ketubah. But it's only good advice, and she doesn't actually have to. And I'm going to bring a proof that the Yehuda was just giving good advice, but really the burden of proof is on the orphans. Because after all, the fact that it's good advice must be so, because if not, if it was required, then we could have solved the Yochanan that same question from the following Mishnah. It's coming up in the next daf. She can sell land for sustenance, even without a betin, and she just writes that I sold this for mizonot. She should write it. And now we don't prove from there. How come we don't prove from there that she needs to keep receipts? That's because it's a burden of proof is on her. We don't say that. The reason is because that Mishnah, everybody all know, is only giving her good advice, so that she says, this is for mizonot and not for my ketubah, and that way it will make her life easier. But technically she doesn't have to. That's why we didn't use that Mishnah to answer the Yochanan's question. So the same explanation we will give to that Mishnah. Hachiname esatova kamashmalan. Rabbi Yehuda here also just tells good advice, not a letter of the law. All right, that's all one way to say that it's not a machloket tanaim, and now we'll say also the other way. Or maybe in fact everyone agrees that the land is in the holding of the orphans, and therefore it's upon the widow has to bring the burden of proof. And the reason why the Yoseh says that don't write anything, just leave it, just say I sold the land, and not to write anything, even though the burden of proof will be on her, is Kideh Abaye Kashisha, as the elder Abaye said, Damar Abaye Kashisha, Mashal de Rabbi Yoseh, Lema Davar Domeh. He explained to Rabbi Yoseh why Rabbi Yoseh says not to write anything. Lishchiv Mera, Shamar Tenu Matayim Zuz Leploni Baal Hobi, Nasa Behobo Notlan, Nasa Bematana Notlan. If someone is on his deathbed and he says, give 200 zuz to this person that I owe him money. Now, when someone says a shchiv mera, when someone on deathbed says something, then it has to be given to him even from land. So it's a serious gift. Now, the person receiving it, he can receive it as payment of the debt that the person who died owed him, or he can receive it as a gift. It's his choice to say, this was a gift that he gave me, and then he can go and also collect his debt. Now, obviously, it's better for the recipient to say, that was just a gift, and I'm still going to go and collect the debt. Right? If he takes it as a gift, isn't that better for him? Because in fact, not only can he now collect, can he still collect the debt, he has a lien on the person who dies property, even if that property has been sold. And so by taking the other one as a gift you cannot collect from property that's sold. So designating that one as a gift, he can still go back and collect the debt and collect it from sold property. So it's better to have that option to designate it as such. Same is true for the Biyoseh. If she leaves it blank, she says, I'm selling this an unspecified purpose, that leaves her the option later that if there is no more funds in the estate, she can say, I received this as sustenance, but I'm still on my ketuvah, and she can go and get lien property even if it was sold to pay the ketuvah. And so that is better for her. Now, even though, according to the Biyoseh, she will have to prove, even though we're now following the opinion that says she has to make the burden of proof is on her, nevertheless, it still would be in her advantage. So she'll bring witnesses, right? She'll make sure that she has witnesses that she used this money for sustenance, and then with witnesses, she'll be able to go and collect her full amount of her ketubah. Whereas if she specifies, oh, this was for sustenance, then it doesn't matter if she has proof or not, she won't be able to go and collect the full ketubah from the land that was already sold. So you see that it's not just the facts on the ground, but also how you designate, right? What category you put something in will make a big difference in the final outcome. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.